Hey Groovers, this is Tim with a quick intro. Kurt and I have been working on two things recently. First, a new series for Behavioral Grooves we're calling New Voices. With New Voices, we'll be sharing short interviews with grad students and newly minted PhDs on the directions they see behavioral science research headed in the coming years. And second, we've been working on a brand new podcast channel called Weekly Grooves. Now, Weekly Grooves is a short-form view of the weekly headlines through a behavioral science lens. It's a totally separate podcast, and we encourage you to check it out. Now, for this episode, we're republishing a terrific conversation we had with economist and author Caroline Webb. We love Caroline's book, How to Have a Good Day, and we love talking to her about her work both as an economist and as a musician. On top of that, Caroline is just one of those people that's really great to hang out with. So we hope you enjoy this episode of Behavioral Grooves with one of our favorite guests, Caroline Webb.
Welcome to the Behavioral Grooves podcast. My name is Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. We talk with interesting people in order to unlock insights into behavioral science and how we can apply them to work and life.
Caroline Webb is not an underachiever. She is an Oxford undergrad, she went to Cambridge for graduate school, and she was a research fellow at the Levy Economics Institute. And then she joined McKinsey and Associates, where she consulted on some really incredible projects. We had the luck to interview her about her wonderful book, How to Have a Good Day, and discovered that there's much more to Caroline than just writing a wonderful how-to guide that has now been published in more than 60 countries.
Yeah, she is absolutely an overachiever and just a delightful conversationalist as well. Caroline splits her time between speaking at conferences like the Davos World Economic Forum, consulting with Global 1,000 companies, and singing at Carnegie Hall in New York City, where she now resides. How to Have a Good Day is a monstrous book, and we highly encourage you to check it out. Not only is it filled with great ideas with big aha moments, she's great at prodding you with the and then bullet points and summaries.
Our conversation with Caroline spent some time on how having a good day at work can be positively influenced by primes, those somewhat tiny subconscious triggers that we have that can influence our subsequent behavior, like socks.
Socks?
You know, socks can be primes. I think we've talked about this.
We talk about it all the damn time. What kind of socks are you wearing right now?
I'm wearing my beer drinking socks. They have little things of beers and anyway.
Okay, we also talked about goals and how personal and very specific goals make a huge difference in our work and how it's important to have both large scale and these small specific goals to really maximize our return.
Right. We talked to her about a component that she talked about, the personal why, and which is really about intrinsic motivation and how that is so key to being motivated. She gave some really practical ways in order to enhance your intrinsic motivation, even when that task at hand isn't always fun. We also talked about why it's important to have a devil's advocate in your life. Tim?
Well, back to Carnegie Hall, I just want to say that this year Caroline's performing a rendition of Handel's Messiah, and that she comes from a long line of musicians in her family. And she let us know that while she does use Donna Summer's I Feel Love as a prime, she also has dozens of primes for different priming soundtracks, for different effects and different reasons, okay? It's not just Donna Summer.
But she doesn't use socks, so that's not her thing. But anyway, we digress.
We should send her some socks.
We should. There we go. On a note, we had some technical difficulties with our first interview with Caroline, but she must have liked us enough, or she was just feeling sorry enough for us that she granted us a full second interview. So what you are hearing today is that second one. So with that, please sit back and with your favorite recording of some Western European Baroque music.
You know what they say, if it's not Baroque, don't fix it.
That was a Tim line. Just sit back and enjoy our conversation with the multi-talented, overachieving Caroline Webb.
Caroline Webb, welcome to the Behavioral Grooves podcast.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
It is great to have you here. It really is. This is just for our listeners, for the sake of full disclosure, we had some technical difficulties on our first interview with Caroline, and we're excited to be returning to the scene of the crime.
Super excited.
Yeah. So we're going to get started with the speed round. Kurt, do you want to start with the speed round?
Yeah, I think this is going to be unfair because she's already had a preview of these if she can remember back for a couple of weeks. But we'll start. Here we go. All right, Caroline, unicycle or bicycle?
Oh, bicycle. I used to love riding my bicycle with no hands on the handlebar as a kid. So
Awesome.
yeah, absolutely.
Ooh, no hands. Okay.
Yeah.
Would you prefer to get 8 hours sleep the night before the big exam, or would you study all night?
Oh, always 8 hours sleep. I'm not sure I always did that actually when I was a student, but absolutely now as a grown up, knowing all the research, no question, 8 hours sleep.
Great.
New
Milton or New York?
You can't say that. New Milton is where I grew up. That's part of my DNA. But I do love New York. Despite my accent, that is where I live, and it's really become a fantastic home. So thank you, New York.
Yeah, very much so. Okay, so would you rather sing in the choir at Carnegie Hall or do a solo performance at Carnegie's Deli?
Well, so that's a sneaky question. So I do sing at Carnegie Hall twice a year as part of a chorus. So yeah, I've got to say I love that. It's just it's a great performance energy from the whole space there. So yes, there we are. I'm busted. my side gig.
Well, we love the fact that you sing at Carnegie Hall. I mean, that is just there are very few people, I think, around the world that can actually say that. So it's a wonderful testament. So.
Yeah, it's a pretty. I think
you
it's a
haven't
pretty.
heard me sing though. You never know. I might be just hiding behind all of my chorus mates.
So that's how I sing in a choir. I just mouth the words, and then the choir sounds good. So.
Well, we absolutely have to come back to that. That's definitely going to be a part of our conversation. And Kurt, whether you like it or not.
I know.
But let's start by. Should we start talking about the book a little bit? I think How to Have a Good Day is a terrific read. Honestly, I was just so delighted as a bullet point guy myself. I was so delighted to see your very generous use of bullet points.
Well, I know people are really busy and that they may need to just turn to the quick take on how you handle a difficult conversation. And, you can read the whole chapter, but that, I know that you might just need the summary bullet points, Well, just possibly.
Well, what I love about the summary bullet points is that I do read the full chapter, but the summary bullet points allow that refresh to remind me of what I just read. And I think it anchors it in more. So from that perspective, that's what I really love about the structure of the book and the way that the book is going. So
thank you. I did try to walk my own talk in thinking about how to structure it, because I do know that, the research is really clear on the fact that if you take even just a second or two to step back and reflect on what it is you've just learned, you actually have much higher recall and much more insight that's gained from the experience. So that's a little bit of what I was trying to do with each chapter,
I think you were successable. So there you go.
So you are so intentional. I'm sorry. It's just amazing how intentional you are. I'm sorry, Kurt. Go ahead. I love that about you.
So in the book, you talked about you brought up Kahneman and thinking fast and slow, and you talked about his use of system 2 versus system 1, and you relabeled that to deliberate and automatic, which I think is actually brilliant, and we can talk about that for a little bit. But when you think about that, why do you think it's important that we need both? Because that's a key piece of what you bring up in the book, that both are really important parts of our thinking.
Right. Well, one of the reasons I renamed it from System 1 and System 2 to the automatic and deliberate systems is because I could never remember which one was which. I have a little trick. And, of course, that is your System 2, your slow system, your deliberate system, having to work really hard. And so I thought, well, let's make it just a little bit easier for the brain's deliberate system. So, yes, we have these two systems, and they are working in tandem beautifully all the time, every day, keeping us focused on the things that matter. And, the reason that we need both is because we need to do our best and highest thinking, our careful reasoning, the sort of mindful weighing of pros and cons and so on that system two, or as I would call it, the deliberate system, everything we do deliberately takes care of. And we need the automatic system to automate kind of almost everything else, because otherwise our poor deliberate system gets tired very quickly and gets overloaded very easily. So what's happening is that it's a bit like, your deliberate system is the super clever professor, but gets overloaded very, very easily. And the automatic system is the hyper efficient assistant who mostly is amazing and fantastic. Just occasionally takes shortcuts that might be not quite so smart. But mostly we're very grateful to the assistant.
I love. Well, Oh, go ahead, Tim.
Well, I was just going to say, I think Kurt's system one never is out of line. Kurt's system, is perfect. It's always, his automatic system is flawless.
Perfectly, if I just want to eat chocolate all day. There you go. Caroline, why this is since we've had this conversation from our first conversation back, I've been thinking about this, and I'm going, why do you think Kahneman, and I don't know if you can answer this or just have an opinion on it, with all of his brains and the insights that he has, I find that it's very true that system one and system two are not intuitive to how we would actually do it. And from a framing perspective, automatic, deliberate, you could probably come up with a multitude of other nomenclatures for this. Did I just say that wrong? Anyway.
I think you totally muffed it, but that's okay.
That was my system one going on. But
you're absolutely right. I mean, cognitive neuroscientists have called they have a different name for the two system process, which is the X system and the C system.
Yeah.
So I think that we've been struggling with what to call these things for a little while, and of course, John Haidt calls it the elephant and the rider, and that's really evocative.
Yeah.
I like that too.
Yeah.
I was a big fan of Jonathan's approach with the elephant and the rider for a long time. But I have to admit, I'm totally onto automatic and deliberate. I feel like that is really more succinct and more effective way of talking about it to people, and to say, our deliberate decision making or our automatic decision making seems to make more sense. And I'm wondering, are you finding that? Are you getting good responses from people?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because a lot of people will say deliberative instead of deliberate. I don't mind that. I mean, the whole idea is that what you're doing deliberately is handled by that system, and what you're doing automatically is handled by the other system. And I did have a conversation with Daniel Kahneman about the two systems, and he said that if he were to rewrite Thinking Fast and Slow, he might bring out the hero aspect of the automatic system a little bit more fully, because you really do need both of them. You just need to understand the weaknesses, the little the little quirks of each system, and then you can really go with the grain of how your brain works. So you need to understand your deliberate system gets tired easily, can only do one thing at a time, can only take in a certain amount of information, and you need to understand that your automatic system takes shortcuts, and sometimes those shortcuts are amazing, and sometimes they lead you to do silly things.
Right.
And if you can understand that the more tired and overloaded your deliberate system is, the more likely it is that your automatic system will be in charge. You're gonna make much more mindful choices about how you spend your day and how you interact with people.
How familiar are you with the research from Antonio Damasio, what he did on that, where he took his medical patients that had a debilitating brain injury or some lesions on their brain that actually impacted that automatic system and that emotional response, and found that those people, they couldn't even decide which restaurant to choose. So
it's a really, I actually channel that a little bit when I'm running workshops on the topic, and I'm just introducing the idea, right? I get people to think about, if your deliberate system were in charge of choosing a restaurant, then, how would you do that? If you would, sometimes we are very, very deliberate about where we go for lunch, but most of the time we don't build an exhaustive spreadsheet of every restaurant that is possibly reachable on a given day, and then code multiple columns of attributes and then weight the scores. Can you imagine? I mean, if we actually made small decisions like that, it would be absolutely paralyzing. And that is, of course, what Damasio's research showed. And it's a really nice way of saying, you know what? It's not a question of your deliberate system being smart and your automatic system being stupid. It is a question of using each system for the purpose that it's best at.
Are you aware of it? Do you make conscious decisions now, given the amount of research and work that you've done in this field? Are you conscious of saying, no, I actually want to get out of my automatic and be deliberate about this?
Oh, gosh, yes. I mean, I had a few filters for what went in the book, and one was that I had to only use techniques that I could really, really, truly back up with replicated science. But another was that I had to only put stuff in the book that I actually use myself, I don't want to be one of those people who gives advice and then doesn't take it themselves. So that took out quite a lot of content. And the stuff that I talk about in the book, I have this section on cross-check routines and how you can, just when you're making a really important choice, that you slow yourself down and say, okay, you might say, what does, what you might sort of adopt a devil's advocate and imagine in your mind who would be likely to argue against this. And I think about what would they say to me right now. And I don't necessarily have to take on board what they're saying, but just the very fact of slowing down and asking myself really, it really makes a big difference. And I do that especially when I'm annoyed. Because when I'm annoyed, I know that there's less activity in my prefrontal cortex. And so I know that it's time to kind of just notice that I'm aggravated, step away, and then just come back with a fresh pair of eyes. And so frankly, if you did nothing else but that would be helpful.
Tim, if we followed that advice, we would never be able to write a book because we don't follow any of our own advice.
Yeah, sorry, that's spoiler alert.
No book coming out from Tim and Kurt in anytime soon.
Any near future.
So, Caroline, you started your career as a research fellow at the Levy Economic Institute. Help us understand how you transitioned from that into this work that you're doing now.
Well, when I was an economics student, the Berlin Wall came down, and
wow.
That seemed, I know.
Wow. No, I'm not at time, but I mean, what is momentous?
Yeah. Wow, she's so old.
No, you're taking it the wrong way. No, I mean, just like that's such a momentous experience.
Yeah.
My gosh.
And so, as a sort of fledgling economist, I just thought this has to be the most interesting thing that any economist could ever want to look at, totally. To think about. I wasn't quite right about that because obviously not everybody thought that, they should spend their lives studying it. But for me, that was just absolutely fascinating because it brought together, it wasn't just economics per se, it was politics and psychology. And my interests were always, in that sort of broader sense of, how do human beings thrive and come together and function at their best. And so, those first few years of my professional life, I was focused on the changes in Central and Eastern Europe. And I spent a year researching that. I was based at the Levy Institute, but I spent a good bit of the year on the ground in Prague. And then spent a couple of years in public policy as a public policy economist, helping the British government give support to the region. So, that was building stock exchanges and figuring out how to actually have central banks. And after years of not really having any of those sorts of institutional structures. And I just loved the combination of the fact that there was an enormous shift that was going on at a macro level, but there were at a small everyday level, there were tiny changes that each individual was having to make, actually big changes that each individual was having to make. And I think that was what seeded my interest in personal change. I saw societies that had to absolutely turn on a dime in terms of what they valued and what they pursued. And I think that although I then went on to do public policy work in other areas, and then I went into management consulting and focused on organizational change and really the seeds of interest in what I did were planted back then, in the late 80s and early 90s. So I've always been interested in human change. It's just that the canvas on which I've been interested in it has shifted over the years. Does that make sense?
Totally. I think it's so interesting. It reminds me of Coleman's boat, the Coleman's idea of sociological change, at the macro level, influencing the micro level change and vice versa.
Yeah.
How individual changes influence the community and how the community influences the individual.
Yeah.
And right. I mean, it almost sounds like your fascination was, at least at first, sociological.
Yeah. I think, my first economics teacher when I was 16 was, I didn't realize it, but he wasn't really teaching us economics. He was really teaching us to be critical thinkers about human behavior.
Wow.
And we only just barely managed to get through the examination because he wasn't really teaching to the curriculum. But he taught us, to think philosophically, politically, psychologically, and as you say, sociologically. So yeah, I mean, when I went into management consulting, my interest was getting closer to that again. That human dimension. And initially, I was working on these huge projects, huge cultural change projects at large organizations, and then over time, I just again found that it was down to individual leaders and managers, and the behaviors that they showed to the world day in, day out had such a disproportionate impact on the people around them and then the changes that they were trying to make, that I became more and more interested in that, in the small stuff, let's say, the everyday stuff and the individual stuff.
Do you find more joy out of working, because you have done these massive projects that influence, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, as well as workshops where you're working with very small groups.
Yeah.
Do you find more joy in the smaller groups? Is there more personal benefit to you in that?
Well, I think I came to understand over the years that although I have a technical background and I did like math, I was really into all of that stuff. Actually, my strengths really lie particularly in the interpersonal space. And so, yeah, I think, that was a big personal journey for me to actually recognize that and then lean into it over time. And, when I was at McKinsey, the consulting firm, I was very lucky because, I initially, when I first joined, they just wanted me to do extremely technical work. And I kept on saying, no, I really want to do the people stuff. And then eventually they let me have a go. And
thank goodness.
And then I didn't really look back, but they allowed me to experiment and push and build actually quite an innovative practice in behavioral change. And yeah, I did find over time that I got more and more energy from the face-to-face, the sort of deeply personal. And so I had to think quite carefully about who I work with, so that I'm helping the right people have a strong positive impact on the world. But the reason for writing the book was because as my work became more intimate, I thought, wow, wouldn't it be nice if I could still have a wider way of reaching people? So the book was a way of doing that. And I'm so delighted I did it, even though it was the hardest thing I've ever done.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Wow. Well, I think so too. I'm sorry, Kurt, go ahead. But I have to just say, I'm glad you wrote it because I think that it really gets right down to the very specific deliverables that it seems to me that virtually anybody can pick up the book and benefit from it.
Oh, thank you.
I think it's terrifically written.
That's really what I was trying to do. I was really trying to make it accessible to anybody who has kind of aspiration to be at their best more often and an ability or an interest in the evidence behind it, right? I mean, that doesn't require formal education, but it does require a little bit of a curious mind. So I was writing for that person for sure.
Yeah, so let's get into some of the details in the book, because in the book, one of the things you talk about is setting goals and how important setting goals are. But you actually bring two traits into that, where you talk about setting personal goals and then setting specific goals. So help our listeners understand the difference between those two and how they impact each other.
Well, all of us have to-do lists that are, long, very long. And, we don't always feel that we get to the end of them. I remember actually talking to a colleague who is getting very stressed about not being able to complete his to-do list each day. And I said, welcome to the world. That there's a point of maturity in your career where you get to the point where you cannot possibly finish everything that's on your list, and embrace that. That is the reality of growing up. So luckily he didn't punch me.
Yeah, good.
But yeah, we are perpetually feeling like there's more that we should be doing. So how do we manage that? There's definitely some stuff that's on our list usually that we're not super excited about. And so there, I think it's helpful to harness the research on intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, because we know that if you can find some kind of personal why, behind even the most annoying work, you will perform better, be more creative, be more likely to do your best with it. And, sometimes it's when you've been delegated a task and it's really not what you wanted to spend time on, asking yourself who's going to ultimately benefit from this, results initially in a pretty sarcastic response, or at least it does for a Brit like me. You think, oh, well, who's going to benefit from this? Ultimately, my boss. My boss is going to benefit from this. Yay. But if you can push beyond that and actually push to say, okay, now who ultimately is going to benefit if I get this work right? Maybe it leads to the leaders of your organization making better choices, and that means that customers, benefit from having a better range of products, or better customer service, or maybe if you're not so excited about serving customers, maybe there's something about the sustainability of the company. So if there's something on your to-do list that is not particularly exciting to you, it's really helpful to harness the evidence around intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, because it turns out that if you are doing something that is deeply meaningful to you, you will perform better in general against any kind of complex or interesting task. As long as it's not a super basic task, you'll perform better if you feel that it's somehow worthwhile, as opposed to something that's just pursuing externally conferred status. Maybe it's something that's been delegated to you by a boss and you're just ticking a box. So the trick is then to think about, well, how can I make this extremely annoying thing that has been delegated to me by my boss something that feels really personal? And there, really just a couple of simple questions that are going to help you. It might be, who is ultimately going to benefit from this piece of work being done well? Maybe it's a colleague, maybe it's the team, maybe it's a customer. And you can also work it back for the other way around and say, well, what is it that I really care about? What really motivates me? What am I excited about? And how does this task in some way speak to that? And there was a guy that I ran into. I was coaching a hospital CEO for a while, and he was new in role, and he was doing a walk around the hospital before anyone really knew his face well, and just to try and get a bit of a sense of what it actually felt like on the ground. Mm-hmm. And he told a wonderful story about the porter in the hospital who was fixing a door, which was apparently squeaking. And the CEO asked this guy, so why are you doing this? And instead of saying, well, I'm doing it because it's on my to-do list, he said, well, I'm doing it because it's going to help patients. Because every time they go through on a trolley, on a gurney, the door sticks a little bit, and it just gives them a really jarring jolt. And that's not very good, is it, if they're ill? You don't want that. And so he had just naturally got this ability to frame it in terms of the benefit to patients. And
that's terrific.
Pretty simple job, I'm sure, to fix the door. But, he will have done it better. He might have seen something else that needed fixing, and he will have been more excited about fixing that. And it's the same is true for us when we're dealing with perhaps a report that we're not that excited about. Focusing on what is the benefit is going to make us more intelligent as we do it. And then the other thing you were asking me about was, I think, specifics.
Yeah. So you talked about personal and specific goal, as the two traits of those of a goal, right?
Yeah. And then there's an enormous amount of research on the power of being very specific about what it is that you're trying to do. And, it's not to say that you don't want the big lofty goals that make you feel like life is worth living. We've just talked about the fact that, actually having a clear sense of the personal why of why something is meaningful to you is really helpful. But often when we think about things that are on our to-do list that sit there for weeks and sometimes actually years, it's because it's just too big or too vague. And we haven't really been specific enough in thinking about what is the very first small step that I need to take. And if you go back to system 1 and system 2, or the automatic system, the deliberate system, you want to make it as easy as possible for your deliberate system to figure out what it needs to do next. And that's why specific goals tend to get done and vague ones don't.
Yeah. I was at, I guest lectured this morning at a local university and was surprised that it was in a group of 50 or so juniors and seniors. The way the salespeople articulated their goals were lofty and huge and, sort of the BHAG, the big, hairy, audacious goals. And then I said, well, what about marketing? Because it was mostly marketing majors. And the marketing majors, they spoke much more specifically about, well, what I'd like to do is get into marketing analytics, or I'd like to get in, they had little bricks size, these very specific. And I thought that was really interesting. Do you think, so Caroline, do you think there's a difference in the way people naturally set goals? Do you think that some people are predisposed to these BHAGs, these monstrous lofty goals, and some people are more predisposed to sort of more smaller, more incremental size goals?
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And the thing is that if you are a very pragmatic, okay, what is it I do next in the next 10 minutes person, you might want to pay a little bit of attention to, well, what am I truly trying to achieve here? What are my bigger, more motivating, more meaningful, bigger picture goals? Because they're going to help you lift your performance when you're dealing with complexity and when you're hitting bumps on the road. On the other hand, if you're the sort of person who's all about the vision, then, actually boiling it down to, okay, but what do you do this afternoon? And actually specifically, what do you write now? Which email do you send? Oh, which email address do you need to actually find so you can send that email? Right? So you need that complementarity between the huge and the tiny in order to really achieve great things.
I wanted to talk about actually something that is close to Kurt's heart, and that is priming. Yeah. So, reminding yourself to stay on track. And I know that, you admitted to Donna Summers being a prime for you, right? And
yes.
Kurt has actually done a lot of work in priming, and he uses socks as his primary prime. So maybe the two of you could just compare primes.
Tell us about your socks, Kurt.
Oh, the listeners have heard a lot about my. I definitely wear socks for a very specific purpose of the day. So if I know that I am going to be speaking with clients or doing a presentation where I need to be smart, I will wear my Einstein socks that have pictures of Einstein on them. If I know that day I need to maybe be a little bit more aggressive, I'm not naturally an aggressive person in a sales situation or in asking people for favors or to do something, I will often wear my shark socks that again prime me to be thinking about shark and being more aggressive. So those are the types of and
great.
Actually many pairs of socks that I wear on various different occasions. So.
And what I love about that is, when you think about the priming field, it's obviously been a source of huge controversy. The fact, the idea that if you give people a warm drink, that it'll make them warmer and friendlier because of the associations that they have with that warm drink. And I think the challenge with that research and the reason why there have been issues with replication is that we don't know what associations are stored in other people's minds.
Yes.
So how can we be sure that what we think will prime them to behave in a certain way will actually achieve that? I mean, there's certainly, some things you can imagine that, upbeat songs in a major key will tend to boost people's mood more than drifty, smushy songs in a minor key. But, the thing is that we can only be really sure of our own associations. And if you know that those socks make a huge difference to your mood because of the associations you have with it, then, oh my goodness, I think that's the most precise use of enclosed cognition that I think I've ever heard. I love it.
So help us understand Donna Summers in you. And I know that it may not be Donna Summers anymore, but how did you use that, and what do you use today?
So I remember seeing a Blue Man Group show, and this was years ago back in London when I was still living there. And in the finale, there was this incredible moment where a lot of stuff happened that was interactive. There were things coming down from the ceiling, and I just loved the show. I was so into it, and I just loved the performance energy of these guys. And the song that was playing in the finale was Donna Summer's "I Feel Love," and so and I'm a musical person, so music really makes a big difference to me. And so what happened after that was that whenever I heard the song, I thought, wow, yeah, and it reminded me of that moment. And so I started to use that as one of my primes for going on stage, or embarking on something which required a little bit of that performative energy from me, to put me in a high energy state of mind that would allow me to kind of perhaps not perform the gymnastics that the Blue Man Group managed to put on stage.
Oh, come on. Come on.
At least radiate a little bit of energy. And so, I put that in the book as an example. And then the Financial Times review of the book homed in on that at that fact. And now, of course, I get asked about Donna Summer quite a lot. Often when I'm giving a talk, that will be the song that someone has played as I'm coming on stage. And, it still works. It still works every time. But I actually have quite a few playlists. I have a playlist for workshops that I play every time when I'm setting up the room and I'm waiting for people to arrive, that just, gets me into the right state of mind. So, I'm pretty fluid in thinking about what playlist is needed for one particular moment.
But you're purposeful in that playlist and how you're actually using that music to, enlighten those neural networks that are going to put you in the state of mind that gets you to the desired outcome that you want. And again, as Tim mentioned, very purposeful in those manners. That's the same way when I think about the socks that I put on in the morning. I'm going, all right, what do I need to do? Yeah. And it's not just the colorful ones. It's like if there's something specific. Now, many days I just wear the old black, little socks, but those are just the boring days.
I totally get it. Absolutely. And I think, actually, and this may be more of a female thing than a male thing. I think, women are often thinking, who do I need to be today? What is it that I need to convey? Because, our outfits are often, they're more varied than men's. Mm-hmm. And, we often dress to think about what is it that we want to convey to everyone else. But, it's extremely powerful to think about, well, what mood do I want to be in? What kind of zone do I want to be in? And what's going to actually create that for myself? So I love the fact that you found a way to do that. It's brilliant.
There you go. Well, my stepsister-in-law wears her power pink, outfit when she needs to be on. And she knows that. And she knows that it's more of a internal component for her. I don't think she's ever associated it with priming, but she definitely does do that. So I think there's some validity in what you're talking about from that element, because I don't think there's very few men that I would know that say, I'm wearing this outfit to convey a certain message to myself. Although that I'm generalizing probably there, and who knows?
My husband has one specific tie that I gave him.
He has one tie?
Yes. Now, if anyone who knows him is listening, they're going to think, which one is it? Which one is it? I'm not going to give that away.
But he wears that for specific purposes.
Yes. Yeah. When he wants to, when he's wanting to step up his game, and he's really, it's an important meeting. Yeah.
So, with all that, so do you think priming? So you're not saying that priming doesn't work, of course. I mean, you're saying that priming is effective, but do you think that it's ineffective on a marketing level? Do you think that getting back to this idea of trying to appeal to the complexities of every individual with their own memories, do you think that that's wasted effort?
Well, I'm not an expert in marketing, but I think that the thing that we can be certain of is our own associations. I think the controversies in the field of priming research have centered on the question of can you prime other people? And is it conscious or unconscious? And, those are the two big debates, and, quite acrimonious debates that are going on. But, what you can be sure of is consciously priming yourself on, using associations you definitely have. Now, can you have subliminal influences on people as they, or not even subliminal? Can you influence people to have more warmer feelings towards your product? Of course you can. I mean, that is really what marketing is trying to do. And I think that what behavioral science is doing is becoming more precise in how to help marketers figure out what those connections, what those aspirations might be. I just know that it's a surer bet to figure out how to prime yourself than it is to prime other people.
That makes sense. And I don't think that would go counter to like Cialdini's work. I think that, he has lots and lots of examples of very subtle unconscious primes, but I don't think he would say that priming ourselves would be, I think he would agree that priming ourselves, our individual self is more effective. And we're going to do better at that.
So Caroline, in the book, you talk about tiny tweaks, about identifying tiny tweaks that can help you have a better day, better life, things from like multitasking or stopping multitasking, sleep, positive thinking primes, which we just talked about, physical activity, when-if scenarios. So if you had to say of those, and there's even many more of them, but what would you, if you had to give advice to the listeners and saying, look, if there are 2 or 3 things of those tiny tweaks that you think can have the biggest impact on somebody's daily life, can you call out 2 or 3, or is it dependent on the individual?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, it is dependent on the individual, but I'll tell you one thing that combines a few different strands of the research that I do every day. And I'm not a very routinized person. So, this is definitely something which I would say is a no-brainer for me. And it's working something that, as you know, behavioral economists call the peak end effect. And, the way that works is that we have limited capacity to remember everything that ever happened in our lives. And so we actually don't remember every aspect of every experience. Actually, when we look back at the quality of an experience, we tend to remember the most intense moment and the end. So, the way we think about the quality of this podcast, and no pressure, right? But we've got to end on a real high note, is it's going to be the average of the most intense moment and the way it ends. And so, that is something that we know about the way that our memory works. And so, when you get to the end of a day that's maybe not been great, how on earth do you end on a high? Well, you can end on a high and, knowing that that's going to disproportionately affect the way you remember the day by thinking about what was it that went well today, even if it was mostly a pretty crappy day. And just forcing yourself, perhaps forcing is too dramatic a word, but, really encouraging yourself to think about, okay, well, there was that moment. I actually remembered my umbrella today. That was good. Or, I got to that meeting on time, even though the traffic was terrible. Or, there was that moment when someone actually smiled or helped me out. And if you don't stop to remember, you will likely forget. And by ending your day with this kind of reflection, it combines a lot of research on gratitude. It combines some research on the peak end effect, and it also combines in the research on selective attention. Because unless you direct your attention to something deliberately, then there's a good chance you're going to forget it. And so that starts to rewrite the history. Starts to rewrite the story of how you think about your life.
So do you have to do that at the end of the day, or can it be? I'm thinking your days kind of parceled out into different aspects of it. So at the end of your work day, is there value in doing that same thing about what you just did at work and thinking about that, and then going maybe, at the end of the day, again, doing it again at the end of the day? Is there value in doing it multitudes of times during that day at different breaks?
That's a great question. Yeah, I would say, this is a bit fractal, right? I mean, actually at the end of each meeting, how nice is it if you actually say, what, that was great. Here are the things that I'm going to take away from this and that I really appreciated. And, how even better if you can get everybody to share their own version of that. At the end of a conversation, if you say, it was really great talking to you. I really liked hearing about XYZ. Just taking a moment to recap and think what was great about that at the end of each major experience, at the end of each working day. Yeah, it really makes a difference to how you start to think about the quality of those experiences. And that really adds up.
And you did that with your book, as we talked about at the very beginning of this, with the bullet points at the end of each chapter, in kind of providing a shortcut for people to say, here are the highlights, here are these peak things from this chapter that you can now remember, and now it's at the end, and it brings that back into mind. So I think there's probably a lot of different ways to incorporate that peak end rule into your life. And I think to your point, I think that it brings in a lot of different aspects from a lot of the different psychological and behavioral science research.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
I love that. I love it. Okay, so we started out by talking a little bit about Carnegie Hall versus Carnegie Deli, which, because you're in New York. But let's talk about, I'm really curious about your musical interests, and how is it that you came to be in a choir that performs at Carnegie Hall twice a year? Honestly, I mean, I'd like to get that gig, but also just this must go back a while. How did you get started in the musical thing?
Well, both my grandfathers were very musical. Actually, one of my grandmothers was as well. And I started playing the piano, bashing the piano next to my grandfather at the age of 3 or so. And then piano was the big thing in my life. Apart from everything else that was a big thing in my life. Sport was a big thing. Studies were a big thing. But piano was my sort of very personal retreat. And it was a huge part of my life. I did all of the kind of formal musical training that you can do, and I did music as part of my baccalaureate, and then I realized I couldn't carry a piano around with me, and actually it wasn't always easy to get access to a piano, and so then I started singing a lot more and discovered that that's something you can actually carry with you at any moment.
Yes, it's very
much more portable. Yeah, but I've been in and out of bands and choirs, basically since I was about 14, and
like what kind of bands? Were punk bands?
Oh, goodness. Terrible bands. No, I mean, when I was a kid, we'd form a band, and I was still, as I say, mostly on keyboards. I sort of, migrated gradually to singing backing and backup, and then, from there started to sort of come a little bit more to the front. But yeah, I just, we used to cover pop songs, right? I mean, that's how you kind of learn your chops when you're first starting.
Right.
And then I got into jazz, and then I discovered that I was a better jazz singer than I was a jazz pianist. And so that was one of the things that tipped me a little bit towards singing.
Wow, that's a great realization. I wish I was a better jazz singer than I was jazz player personally, but because I was listening to Ella Fitzgerald recently, and oh my gosh, she always just sends chills up my spine. Okay, but how did we get to Carnegie Hall from playing?
Practice, obviously.
Yeah. Lots of it, but come on.
Yes.
I mean, a lot of people practice and still don't get to Carnegie Hall. So
so my husband also sings, and we moved to New York from London a few years ago, about 3 years ago. Spending a lot of time here before that, but actually, got my green card and was allowed into the country properly at that point. And he reconnected with a conductor that he had loved singing with years earlier, and always said that he'd learned more from this guy than from anyone else. And so he has this chorus called the Cecilia Chorus, and it is just fantastic. It's a mix of and obviously there's a step in the middle there where we both auditioned and then got into the chorus.
Okay,
but,
a minor little thing. Okay,
yeah. But I love it because it is we do a lot of the big classical pieces, but we also commission new work, and we sort of surface work that's been a little bit neglected. So our programs are always really interesting, and and we're doing Handel's Messiah at Carnegie Hall on December 8th. So
what a fabulous piece of vocal music! Oh my God,
absolutely.
Yeah, just absolutely amazing.
Yes.
Okay, so I think that's so cool. But your musical interests are very wide. I mean, if you singing jazz to the classical, the serious music, that's a wide.
Oh, it goes a lot wider. I used to be part of this huge pop chorus in London, and we used to do arrangements of pop songs, about 300 strong, and we'd perform in clubs. So no, I mean, it goes wider. And the music I tend to listen to a lot at home is a lot of instrumental deep house and EDM. So no, the tastes go a little broader than we've talked about so far.
Oh man, Kurt, I'm sorry, we're going to have to schedule another podcast just to talk about music with Caroline. This would be so much fun. Oh man. I mean, the fact that you can say EDM and classical and pop chorus like in the same sentence and I'll have it apply to you, I'm I'm down. I'm so down with that.
Oh, well, Caroline, thank you. This has been, I think, very informative and just fun. And we appreciate you taking time to record again. So thank you for all of that. And thank you for the wonderful insights.
Oh, it's such a huge pleasure. I could talk to you guys all day.
Well, let's do it. Let's do it again. I think it would be.
That would be a good day, right?
Yeah, it would be a good day because today is a good
This
day.
is the peak. When I look back on today, this will definitely be that peak memory. Here we go. So
that's right. Yeah. So thank you so much, Caroline, and we hope to connect with you again soon.
Likewise. Thank you.
welcome to our grooving session, where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our behavioral grooves interview, have a free-flowing discussion on some of those topics, and whatever else comes into our blown minds.
We were blown away.
We were blown away with this interview.
This was so much fun.
It was amazing. So, all right, let's get down to the brass nuts or bolts, brass.
I think brass tacks. Actually.
Brass tacks. See, this is why you are so important to this podcast, Tim. You correct all of my bad analogies. You remember all the people that I forget. It's just
language is dynamic. Haven't we learned that? So if you wanted to call it the brass buttons or the brass switches or the brass hardware or
the copper something or others,
the copper cups, I don't know. It could be whatever it is. We'll go with it.
Anyway, tell me what you liked about this interview with Caroline. What were some of the top things that we learned? There
was so much. This was a jam-packed conversation, and maybe one of the most important things was, as simple as it is, the labeling of System 1 and System 2 thinking as automatic and deliberate. It's just so easy to grasp automatic thinking and deliberate thinking.
It is so true. It's one of those components that I wonder why, again, and we asked her about this, like, why Danny Kahneman is a smart guy.
Yeah, way.
And yet he came up with System 1 and System 2. It's the same thing that I still to this day cannot tell you type 1 error or type 2 error, which one is the false positive and which is the false negative. I have to look it up every single time. Labeling that thinking automatically, that System 1 thinking, is, labeling it automatic is just wonderful.
Right. And then she went on to say and I think Kahneman, I think you've mentioned that Kahneman actually started with this, that our automatic thinking can be the hero.
Right.
We have to stop bashing our System 1 thinking. It's not bad.
It's not bad at all. It is really vital to how we operate in this world. It is the component, and again, we brought up this with the Antonio Damasio component, right?
That's right.
That when people actually lose the ability of their System 1, that emotional trigger that they have, it blows up the rest of their life. They can't make a decision.
They can't figure out what restaurant to go to.
Can't decide what restaurant.
It's too hard.
It's too hard. We need both. The way we have evolved to use both.
So it helped us. It saved us from the tigers 40,000 years ago, and it helps us decide what restaurant to go to tonight. I think it's a pretty good combination.
But the thing that I think is important about this, and we didn't get into this with Caroline, is really it's understanding how the two work together. And for us as people, as humans who are operating in a world that doesn't have too many tigers left in it, at least not ones that are not behind bars or in cages that we run into on a everyday basis. It is those interactions with System 1 and System 2 that we have to understand when is System 1 being helpful and when is System 1 actually leading us down the wrong path. And I think Caroline in her book talks about that and really helps in doing that. I don't know if we got so much into it with the conversation.
Just a footnote. I actually think there is a tiger problem in New Delhi. There, literally, because the tigers are coming in from the forest because development is pushed out so much that they're getting used to people, and they come in, and it's a real thing.
Wow.
Okay, so our listeners in Indy might be going, "Hey, don't forget about us, because it's kind of a big deal.
And I apologize. I am a very myopic U.S. citizen.
Context matters, man.
Context matters. Yes, it does.
Okay,
so,
what else? What else struck you, Kurt?
Well, I think there were a number of things to think about. The extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation component, right? That element of the why. And really getting into that personal why.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think is really, well, know this from the work that we do in incentives, is you can have an extrinsic motivation, and they're very powerful. I am not discounting the power that extrinsic motivation has. But we know for sustained long-term change, intrinsic motivation far outshines extrinsic motivation usually.
In the long term, especially when it comes to actually behavioral change, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, but I loved how Carolyn really focused on this idea of what do I care about? And then the example she gave of the hospital employee who was fixing the doors for the benefit of the patients,
right?
Making that. Kivitz used to talk about the virtuous aspect of our work. That someone even working in a toy store selling batteries to a parent right before a birthday or a holiday could find something virtuous in that, so that the child receiving the toy is going to have batteries and it's going to work.
Right.
There's something virtuous in that.
And I think it's important to know that that's not easy. That was the one thing, because, and we talked a little bit about, the boss giving you a goal, and now you go, oh, why is that important? Because the boss is going to be, good for it, and it does really good for the company. And just the fact of trying to make it virtuous, or bringing it back to the patient, or bringing it back to the customer, is not an easy thing to do.
Right.
But if you can do that, if you can internalize it, then that really makes an important component and really helpful in driving that long-term change. Okay, Tim, what else?
The tiny tweaks discussion, the peak end effect.
Okay.
Like, this is, it's so easy to forget that our memories aren't this perfect video reconstruction of what happened, right? We're remembering bits and pieces.
Right.
We've had this discussion many times, right? That, in fact, we even frame some of our discussions about, do you remember this? Or, no, this is the way I think I remember it, but I'm not sure if that's what happened, right?
Well, but that's a good way of actually talking about memory, because, again, for most of us, we remember what we've remembered. It's this
right.
It's the photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy, and so the clarity of that memory,
it gets gross.
It gets degraded.
Yeah.
So that element, I think, is really important to think about. But yes, peak end rule. Go back to the peak end rule.
Yeah. So so if we have this peak end effect in our memories, why not end on a high? Like, why not end the day on a high? Why not end our discussions on a high? Why not end our interactions? Why not end our personal reflections about our day on a high? I think that's just brilliant.
I think so too.
That's something that just about anybody can apply.
The whole component of ending your day with that gratitude, reflection component of that, but then even applying that into different situations. End of a meeting, reflect, make sure that it's that high point, and specifically building in to your day areas that are going to have some positive effect.
Make them vivid. Make them memorable.
Vivid.
Yeah.
But building in, you really like to exercise. So let's build that exercise into, ending of a certain part of your day that you can reflect back on. Or you love to read. Well, maybe you should, instead of watching television at the end of the day, spend 30 minutes reading, because now you have that end peak.
You could be reading How to Have a Good Day.
You could be reading How to Have a Good Day, which would be a really good thing to do.
It is.
So therefore, you should do that, people.
What else? Kurt, what else struck you? There was so much.
There was so much. I think, again, the piece that was interesting for me, and this is more of a general concept, Caroline was applying behavioral science principles into our everyday life.
Yeah.
Not just in how we work with companies and trying to sell more things to consumers, not in setting policy from this grand scale of government. It was about taking some of these scientific principles and applying them into the everyday acts that we do as human beings. And
she covered a wide variety of those.
And gave really applicable ways of implementing some of those
actionable
elements. And the fact that we all want to have a better day. We all want to be happier in our life. We all want to do. It reminds me of who did we just see in New York that was talking about the her course. This is why we need you to remember names.
Lori Santos.
Yes, from Yale. But she has a course on
Coursera course, yeah.
A Coursera course that you can go out and take, but it is a course about psychology and happiness. Well-being.
Yeah.
But again, she brings up these similar points in applying behavioral science and psychology into making our world, our life happier. And she does it with college students who have a whole component of what surprised me in her talk on that was just how depressed college kids are. And I'm like,
dysfunction, depression.
My gosh, anxiety, a variety of different things where you kind of go, they're 19-year-olds. What
they're at Yale.
Yale. They should have the world on the,
But they don't.
Yes, they don't. Yeah. Anyway, with that, I think it's really important. And I think Caroline does a really great job of bringing these insights into a very actionable manner that really are helping people. And so I would love to be able to do that. Hopefully, we do some of that on the podcast, but I don't think we're doing it.
We can only dream.
Dream on, my man. All right. It's time for music. I know you're going to go there.
Well,
So I have a question for you.
Oh, really?
I know. You hate this when this happens.
I kind of do.
So
are we going to have a lecture on the history of music today?
No, we already did that. So Caroline was originally from the UK. Now she lives in New York.
Yeah.
What UK and New York groups, bands, singers, artists come to mind when you think of like the epitome of either a British band or performer or UK or New York?
Well, she's not from London, so I'm not going to choose a London band.
I'm actually going to choose specific UK.
I'm going to choose a band from Liverpool, but not.
What? There is only one band from Liverpool.
No, the Hollies were from Liverpool.
The Hollies.
And so and yes, this is, from the 1960s, but man, they, Graham Nash and Gene Clark were absolutely pioneers in their harmonies and their work in rock and roll. And then on this side of the pond, I would say the New York band that comes to my mind first is the Talking Heads.
Yep. They're a great band.
Oh my gosh, just amazing.
Yes.
Amazing sound, amazing on so many levels. David Byrne and his compatriots.
I look at the Talking Heads, or I listen to the Talking Heads and think about their music was just, it took this punk component, but yet it had a pop sensibility to it.
Absolutely.
And they combined those two and really just did a wonderful job.
Okay, so, how about for you? What's the epitome of your British band?
Oh, the British band. Well, I won't go back to the 60s because that's well before my time.
Oh.
I will go to the 80s, which is my era, right? When the formative, high school, college years. And I go with a couple of them. It's, Depeche Mode, The Cure, and New Order. Those three, my little synth rock bands, are the epitome for me of what that British sound was, at least for the 80s.
Okay. And
really love those.
And then what about New York?
Ramones. And again, I just, when I think about New York bands or New York musicians, Yeah, I might go.
What about Velvet Underground or New York Dolls?
Yeah,
know?
but you asked what was the epitome, right?
Yeah.
And I didn't have 3 for New York. I just had 1.
Beastie Boys? Would that be too late for you?
Yeah.
No, just not your cup of tea.
Not my cup of tea. No.
Okay. Well, that ended a completely useless conversation.
We're
about
supposed
music.
to end on a peak.
We should end on a high note. So be happy that we have introduced the names of musical groups that everyone already knows. How about that?
Yes. And with that peak, even a better peak, you go out and just have so much fun writing a great review for us on iTunes or other podcast listener, or just share this with somebody that you think would find it interesting.
Yeah,
we
please.
appreciate that.
We certainly do. But please share it with a friend. That would be terrific if you would today.
Adios.